Hey, welcome everybody. This is the ASP.NET Outlook Inspired UI webinar. Now, this webinar was inspired by a roadshow that we had done recently where we're showing off different demos from DevExpress as well as a focus on user interface. In today's webinar, I'm going to go into specifically one demo, and then I'm going to show you how to make a light version of that demo. So let's first start with who I am. So I am Mehul Harry. I'm the Web Program Manager at DevExpress. You can reach me on my email at mharry@devexpress.com and on Twitter at Mehul Harry. So today's webinar, I'm going to cover two basic things. First, it's the DevAV ASP.NET demo. We're going to take a look at the demo, how we developed this demo, what's so interesting about this demo. And then I'm going to actually walk you through a Visual Studio session where we're going to build a light version of this demo to show you that you can take advantage of what we've built and take some of the lessons that we've learned and apply them very easily to some things you're doing. And then we're going to take a look at some things in the demo that we've applied, things like good patterns and practices. So let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is the DevAV demo. Now, you can find this demo online. If we go to, let's go to DevExpress.com. I always like to show where these things are available. Now, first, if you go to DevExpress.com, and if you look under either products or free trials and demos, under the ASP.NET section, under the demos, you're going to find our top 4 demos. Now, we're really proud of these demos. We work hard on these demos. You know, we have, as you know, hundreds of controls. And so to decide, you know, what's the best way to show them, we spend a good amount of time to decide the theme of the demo, pick the right data, the right images, and then finally the look. So we have a set of designers out there who kind of suggest, okay, well, this would be a good look based on, let's say, Outlook.com or Gmail, or here's a great dashboard for a sales view, or, you know, let's base it on hotels.com or something like that. So we take different inspirations to show you what's possible with the powerful and beautiful DevExpress ASP.NET controls. So the Outlook Inspired app is really the DevAV demo. Now, the DevAV is actually the internal name we used. So when we created this demo, we had some constraints for it. And one of the basic constraints was that we wanted to use one database. So what happened is we had this demo for multiple platforms. Now I'm going to make this full screen so you can see a little bit better. And this is the base view, the dashboard view. And here you can see that we're using the dashboard control where I can move these tiles around. I can put it up here, or if I need to see more of the pivot grid, I can do that. And it's got a really nice layout. So as you can see from this demo that it's quite beautiful. Now, as I mentioned, there were certain items that we wanted to have for this demo, not just have one common database, but we also wanted to make it responsive. That means it had to be mobile friendly for tablets, and it had to be beautiful, of course, because, you know, a lot of people look at our demos and have to ask, okay, how can I make this? What is DevExpress all about? I know they make these powerful controls that have great features and functionality, but how do they look? So we had to make it beautiful. Now, fast. Now, our controls are fast by default, but you can make anything slow. So if you take a simple list and you throw 1,000 items to it, of course it's going to be slow. So we wanted to make sure that we had a good set of practices and patterns that we learned in working with large amounts of data, so that way the UI would remain fast for all the different modules. And of course it had to be functional. So we wanted to show a real-world scenario where a fictional company like this Dev Audiovisual that has employees and products and so forth. So a lot of common functionality that you might find in your own applications is in there. And of course it had to be modern. It had to use modern approaches. And so DevAV was born. So this is the ASP.NET version of DevAV. Now, if you wanted to see other ones, you can go to, if you download the trial, and if you install our DevExpress, you'll find the Demo Center. Now, the Demo Center installs all our demos, including all the different platforms. So here's the ASP.NET version. But you'll see that we also have a version for WinForms, and we have it for our other platforms as well. So you can actually take a look. Now I'm going to quickly show you the WinForms version. And if you are interested in this WinForms more or learning more about this WinForms version, I recommend you watch we have a webinar. So I'll show you where you can look up that webinar. But what's interesting about this is that you can see it has a similar set of data. In fact, it's actually the exact same data because, as I mentioned, we're using one common database. And that's something you might find in your own company, where you have a common database, but you need to provide a user interface for different platforms. So, for example, this rich application might be used internally, so it's got things like a ribbon, it's got these different modules for employees, customers, products, and it's a beautiful UI using all these great DevExpress controls. So therefore, for example, you can use the extra grid to find some of these items. Now, you can learn more about that online by watching a webinar that was done last week. In fact, let's just show you where. If you go to YouTube and look up the Developer Express channel, you can find all our webinars there. And so last week, Julian and Seth actually created this webinar called DevExpress WinForms Create Outlook Inspired UI that you guys can watch. So I recommend checking that out to deeper dive. Today we're going to dive into this. So as I mentioned, this demo also had to be friendly for tablets. So what I'm going to show you is that it's also responsive. So as I resize this demo, you can see that it easily is able to handle that. Now, how is this possible? Now, that's what I'm going to show you today. We're using one specific DevExpress control that allows us to do this. In fact, let's take a look at the product screen. So here, as you can see, I've got a grid. Now, if I resize, it says, okay, I have enough real estate here to show the bottom reading pane, and therefore, it's going to display that. However, once it loses that real estate, it hides that reading pane, and it's able to. I've optimized it for tablets. Now, I haven't optimized it for phones because I felt this was a rich enough application that I didn't. For a phone, I would need to rethink it completely. So therefore, it could work on a phone, but it won't look good on a phone because I haven't optimized it for a phone. For a phone, I wouldn't use, let's say, a grid. Wouldn't have this filter or buttons and so forth. I'd have to rethink, okay, what kind of data would I show and how would I show it? But for tablet, for desktops, this is perfect, and it works for a lot of different form factors, and it supports touch. So now let me talk a little bit of other points about this specific demo that are actually quite interesting. So the first is let's dive into a couple of its design points. As I mentioned, we did have some really interesting things. So first of all, this is a fictional company that represents a real business, an AV company. And they have things like video players, TVs, and so forth that they sell as products. And here's their prices and so forth. In fact, let's make this full screen so we can see a little bit better. And as I click on one of these items, you can see that I'm using a grid here for my list view. And as I click on it, I get detail view down here. In fact, I've minimized this screen here for 1280 by 720 for this webinar. And so you're not seeing as much of the screen, but as you go into a larger screen, you're going to see that this section would move up over to the right-hand side as there's more space there and so forth. So it's a really nice intuitive design that supports responsive, as I mentioned. So this app is also broken up into modules. Now, each module follows the same user interface pattern. So for example, if I go to employees, I also see a filter navigation area, I see a set of toolbar buttons, I see the grid, and I see a detail area. In fact, the data is different. So here I'm looking at employees instead of products. And we've got a different metaphor for master detail. So instead of showing any detail, in fact, instead of showing anything in the grid, I'm keeping the grid very simple. And I've removed some things like grid lines to highlight the data a little bit better. I've kept some of the grid line separators, but I haven't kept them all. And this gives the grid a nice effect, a clean look to it. And the fact that I'm not using the standard master detail, where I'm using now a reading pane at the bottom, allows me to do some interesting things here. So therefore, data editing, as you notice here, is disabled. But if I wanted to, I can still edit this record for Brad Farkas by clicking on this item here, which brings up a pop-up screen for allowing us to edit that data. And again, this is a nice clean separation, and I can further go ahead and edit some data, for example, his evaluations or his tasks and so forth. So it's a really nice, clean, beautiful interface built with all DevExpress ASP.NET controls. And because we're separated into these modules that have a common UI pattern, each section is really easy to learn. So once your customers learn one section, they'll be able to leverage, because we're keeping a standard common UI elements across all modules. So even though we have these vastly different items like customers, employees, tasks, and products, we're able to easily show them. Now, information in the list can be displayed in either a grid format or a card format. And this is done using custom templates. So now I can easily see with these card templates, for example, which of these tasks are done or overdue or pending and so forth. Now, we can also have a custom filter. So here, as you can see, I've got a common set of filters. In the navigation area, I've built this beautiful navbar control that allows me to see contextually based on which module I'm in. So for example, products, I'll have a different set of filters. For employees, I had things like salaried and so forth. For tasks, I had pending, completed, and so forth. And for products, I have video players and so forth. So let's say I wanted to have a new filter. I can even click on this toolbar button here that lets me, brings up this beautiful and powerful filter control from DevExpress and says, hey, find me all the product players that contains the word, for example, we can say something like player. And I'll even say, save this filter for future use. So that way I can say find for all players. And it might be nice to put in like an underscore or something. And I'll hit OK. And not only will it go find me all those items and filter those records, but it will also create this custom filter for me. So now I have created a custom item, and I am allowing the user to save that without messing up my user interface, meaning I can have a set of custom filters that are different for each user, and it remains in this clean and beautiful interface. So let's move on. All right. Now, as I mentioned, this reading pane is contextual. So based on which records I bring up, I'm able to display different types of information. So for example, here we're looking at product screens. But if we go to employees, I can look at the detail information for the employees. All right. Now, as I mentioned, it's got a lot of interesting elements into this interface as well. So as I mentioned, the master detail, we've extracted out a lot of the interface. For example, filtering is extracted onto these toolbar buttons, as well as printing and so forth. So even the capability to create new records, create and delete new records has been extracted out. And this was just a design decision we made for this demo. In some of our other demos, you'll find that it can be put inside of the grid as well. I really like this interface. In fact, it's so clean and beautiful. Just for this demo, we actually made a new theme. So if you haven't seen it yet, you can take a look at it's called Mulberry. So we created a new theme called ASP.NET, the Mulberry theme in 14.1. And I'm really proud of this theme. It's beautiful. It's used as CSS3. And it's part of the reason is that we're trying to constantly improve our controls. And theming is an area that I've been wanting to improve. And the reason is a lot of people ask me, hey, Mehul, what about SAS and what about less? And these are items that essentially allow you to work with CSS. And so SAS and less didn't exist at the time when we created our controls. And so when when these things came out, they make a lot of sense. They actually help us. But our controls were designed after the Microsoft ASP.NET theming engine, which is quite powerful. Lets you get very granular. Lets you control different fonts for different controls. But it doesn't make it easy if you wanted to quickly change all of the colors and fonts. Now, in 14.1, we made a new feature for our theme builder. So let me bring up the DevExpress. In fact, let's take a look at it from how you would find it. So if you look under the program files, DevExpress 14.1 components, tools, I believe it's ASP.NET, you'll find our theme builder. Now, you can find it there, or if you've got in your start menu, it also registers it there. But this theme builder, and I believe it's inside of the DevExpress menu as well. Yes, it's under the DevExpress ASP.NET controls run ASP.NET theme builder. If you bring up the theme builder, this allows you to modify our theme. Now, you can create a theme. Hold on, it brought it up to on a different screen, so let's bring it here. So you can allow you to create existing theme, modify existing themes, or create your own themes. So, for example, you can take, let's take Mulberry. And I can change the base color and the font and so forth. Now, if you want to learn more about this, send me an email at mehul@devexpress.com, and I can send you a webinar we did on 14.1. But it's a really good, interesting story that we're doing for themes that it's going to get even better at the next release. But I recommend using one of our modern themes like Moderno, Mulberry, Metropolis, because these themes are using newer approaches. And they work beautifully, they scale beautifully, and I just love their look to them. Okay, so let's move on. So I'm going to talk a little bit. About good practice as well, but let's just talk a little bit about this demo. Now, as I mentioned, we did a certain set of layout. Now, in the layout, it's separated into a few main sections as we're going to see. First is the navigation area. This is where we've got the logo. We've got the menu, the drop-down menu, as I'll talk about, and we've got this filter section. And then we've got this toolbar area that has toolbar buttons, a search button as well. And then we've got the footer area. And finally, we've got the main content area that's broken up into the list view of the grid and then the reading pane. And the reading pane is using some callbacks and so forth. So what I want to do today is build a light version of this in the amount of time we have possible, which is, let's say, about 30 minutes, and show you how close you can get to this layout. And then I'm going to show you that you can take actually this exact demo. So, for example, if you want to take a look, go into your users folder. If you go into public documents, you'll find the DevExpress demos 14.1 or whatever release you have installed. And under components ASP.NET, C# or VB, you will find the DevAV demo, and this is the entire demo. This is the whole shebang. You can find all the different modules, all the different user controls that we've created in there, the app code, app data, and so forth. So we're going to take a subset of this today and make a version of this. All right, so let's get to coding. So in Visual Studio, I'm going to start with a new website. So let's close this solution. I'll say File, New Website, and you can give it any name. We'll call it DevAV Lite. I think 4. 4 sounds like a number I haven't used before. Let's call it 11. Okay, so I'm going to create the using the template gallery, and that's because the template gallery allows me to use one of these themes. Now, you see I'm using web forms. Now, we don't have a version of DevAV for MVC, but it is possible to make that with our ASP.NET controls as well. Now, I'm going to use the empty website to show you how easy it is to get started. So I'll hit Create Project, and when I do, it creates for me a very bare bones website that simply has just references. It doesn't even have a default ASPX file to it. So while that's getting created, Um, let's take a look. Now here in the web config, you can see, let's collapse this, let's make this a little smaller, and you can see I've got basically just some references that I'm going to need and some items. Now right now it's using the DevEx theme and so forth, but what I want to do is I want to bring in a couple of files for the sake of time. So I'm going to spare you guys from watching me type a bunch of things, and instead let's bring up, what I'm going to do is, this is our current site. So let's take one that I did, let's say yesterday, and I'm bringing a couple items. And I promise to show you exactly everything that we bring in. All right, so here, this is our empty site. The only thing I'm going to replace is the web config file, and then I'm going to add these 4 folders. So to show you exactly what we did, it's going to say, hey, let me reload web config, and here's the 4 folders. So we've got an app code where I've got one file, which I promise we're going to go into. In fact, there's some really good stuff in there. And then there's app data. Now this is the common database that I mentioned, the DevAV MDF. This is the one where we all sat down, created some fake names and titles and so forth. And this is the one that's used by all the platforms for DevAV or the Outlook Inspired demos. And of course, then we have a toolbar XML file. This, as it sounds like, is what we're going to use for those toolbar buttons, and we'll get into more into that later. And then we've got a bin folder. Now in here, I'm bringing in, I just delete the app licenses DLL. If you've got a registered version of DevExpress, it creates that, Visual Studio creates that file automatically each time you compile. So I'll just delete that, it's not necessary. The Entity Framework is the only thing I'm bringing in. I'm using Entity Framework, and the reason I included those files in here is just in case I have a different version. So you'll see that sometimes we do include these framework files, and these are pretty small files, so they don't make a huge impact. A large part of what we're going to be dealing with today is the content folder. Content is where we're keeping our styles, our script files, and also our images. So I've got things like our main logo, and I've also got, which doesn't look great blown up because it's a small image, but let's take a look here. I've got the main logo, I've got the footer logo, and other things like employees and so forth. And I've also got this styles file. Now, I'm going to be using a lot of these styles, and this comes directly from the DevAV demo. Yes, you can, as I mentioned earlier, with our themes, you can style using properties in the control. Now, sometimes it makes more sense to create a CSS file. So in the CSS file, I'm doing some common things, obviously, like setting things like background color, minimum width, and height. But I've also got some things where I'm setting up paddings and so forth. So we're not doing anything super complicated CSS-wise in this file, and that's only what I'm using. I'm setting some things like borders and background colors and so forth. So you can explore this file at your leisure, but I just wanted to show you that even though I'm using it, I'm not doing anything very complicated. And then of course in the web config version that I brought in, it has a connection string to our DevAV MDF file, and I commented out the spreadsheet because I'm not going to be using that in this version of the light version that we're making. And finally, it has a theme that's set up to use Mulberry because it's beautiful. It's my new favorite theme at the moment. So highly recommend using Mulberry. So the first thing is, when we get started, we've got nothing in here. We've just got global AJAX file. So what we want to do by starting off is, of course, we need a default ASPX file. So I'm going to add that. So let's start with adding a default ASPX file. Now, just like in DevAV, we actually don't use this very much. So I'm going to leave it alone for just a minute. And the reason I added it is because normally an IIS will look for this file, default or index.html. So it's good to have a default ASPX file. Now you can change those settings, but it's easier sometimes to just add this file. So what I'm going to do though is I'm going to start by talking about some of the common good practices, right? So my two really main goals by showing you this demo is to show you that control that helps you get responsive, but also talk about using good practices in your projects. So good practices and patterns usually are invented because once a project gets really large, that's when it gets unwieldy, and that's when it makes sense. Like, you know, they say it's harder to debug something that you've written than it is to create it the first time. And therefore, sometimes if you take time and say, listen, I'm going to use a good practice here, it can save you time later on when you're trying to manage that project and figure out what the heck was I thinking 6 months ago when I did this workaround and so forth. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the good practices that we've used. And one of those is to use a master page. And a master page allows you to have a set of things that are common across different pages while having a common area that is different in them. So it's kind of like using a template. And therefore, if you take a look at our demo, you can see that we have a look that's similar for employees and for products. And that's because we're using a master page for the toolbar, the navigation, and the footer area, but this area is different for each one of them. So let's do that. We're going to start by using a master page, and I'll right click, I'll say add, and I'll say let's create a master page, and I'll just call it site. Now here, I'm going to go to the design section. In the toolbox, I'm going to add the ASPX splitter control. Now if you're not familiar, this control allows you to separate sections of a website. Now let's bring up the quick documentation for the splitter. And if you go to help.devexpress.com or documentation.devexpress.com, both are the same URLs, you'll find our documentation on the splitter control. So the splitter control, as I said, helps you organize content. And if you go to, sometimes let me just Google ASPX splitter, you can find the link for the demos. Now, if you go to, and you can also find this through demos.devexpress.com. Here's the splitter control. So what the splitter control does, it allows you, let's say, collapse an item or resize an item. And it's very slick that way, and allows you to sort of section out different areas. And in those sections, in those panes, you can embed controls. For example, a list or a grid, and tab view or editors and so forth. It's a very nice control, and it's got a lot of great features. And the reason we're going to use it today is because in full screen mode, it allows you to get a responsive UI. So, for example, this is full screen mode. As you can see, it's taken over the whole page. So I'm going to show you how easy it is. Now, this isn't the only way to get responsive. In fact, in the next version, we've got some exciting things, which is why you haven't heard me talk about responsive UI and so forth just yet. But for this particular demo, we decided to use it. And sometimes we use it in our demos. Sometimes we use straight divs and CSS and media queries. But a lot of that is also built into this control. So for today's demo, I'll be using the ASPX splitter. So I've dropped the ASPX splitter on here. Now, the ASPX splitter is set up so that you can either set it up, it has these panes in it that are laid out either horizontally or vertically. Now, by default, they're laid out horizontally, which means the split happens this way, that they are split vertically because they're laid out horizontally. And so what that means, if it doesn't make any sense yet, is that in the orientation, it sets the direction which to render the panes. What's important, though, what I want to talk about is, based on how you set it up, if you set it up horizontally, is that when you split them, they are split in the opposite direction. So for example, if I set the orientation vertically, they're going to split horizontally, but the child panes will then split vertically and then horizontally, because you don't want it to split in the same direction. You want it to split in opposite directions so that they keep splitting in a expected manner. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set the orientation to vertical, and then I'm going to create some panes. So now what I want to do here is create those panes that we had talked about. So by default, we got 2 panes. So the bottom pane is what I'm going to use. This is going to be the footer area, but the top area is going to be that whole section that we had talked about. So let's look at the demo again. So the top area is not just this navigation area, but it's also this toolbar and other area. So I've got this area and I've got this area, but I haven't created the panes for this area, which is what I'm going to do next. So in the first thing I want to do is split the top area into two sections. One is going to be the navigation, and the other is going to be, the main content area. So I've got the navigation, but the main content area itself, I'm going to split into two. I'm going to split that into the toolbar, and then I'm going to split that into the main content reading pane. So right now, it's hard to kind of visualize it in this manner, but I'm going to show you in a laid out way that makes it a lot more sense. And finally, the footer area, I'm going to split that into two sections as well. I'm going to split it into the logo, and then I'm going to split it into the footer text area. So let's first start with the navigation area, the logo pane. So in this area, I'm going to call it, now it's good to give it some names. So as I mentioned, I will be using some CSS styles from our file. So what I like to do is I like to take the CSS style name, and I'll call it something like logo pane, and also give it some sizes. And these sizes help me define the layout. So I'm going to give that 210 pixels. I'll call it logo pane, and I'll also use this as the name of the pane itself. Now, this is going to be my main content pane. Now, I'm not going to give it a, you can give it a name, it's useful to do that, but what I will do is I'm going to set a minimum size for it, and I explain the difference between minimum size and regular size. Now, this area, we will call it, let's see, yeah, all right, so this area, I'm going to give it a size of 60 pixels, and I'm going to give it a name of toolbar pane. And I'll set that as the name of the pane as well. And finally, this is going to be our main content pane. And I'll give it a name as well here. Now, our footer area, I'm going to set its size to 90 pixels, and I will give this area a size of 210 pixels, and also I'll call it footer image pane, and I'll call this footer image text. I'm sorry, footer text pane. And it's useful to set the name as well. All right, and we're done. So I have now, within a minute, created a layout, and that's why one of the reasons I'm using the splitter control is because now, as you can see, I've created these panes. Now, it doesn't make sense just yet, so let's go ahead and show you what just happened. That was completely awesome. All right, so I want to set up a couple of properties first. So the first thing is, in the splitter control, I want to set it to full screen mode. I've already set the orientation to vertical. I don't want to show separators. And I also want to make sure that I don't allow resizing, because as I said, I'm using the splitter to create these areas for panes that have different sized items that will hold content in there. So now I'm going to go back here and set up a couple of things. The first is, this is where I'll be using the content. So where I'll be using that CSS file. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure I bring in that style. And just by dragging and dropping on there, I've brought in that style. And that style essentially affords me the capability to use some things like having a default background color and height and width. Now, beyond that, I've also created the splitter control. Now, in a master page, what we have is something called a content placeholder. Now, this is important. The content placeholder is, in fact, let me leave it where it is right now to kind of show you. Now, I'm going to do one other thing. If we go back to the design page, it shows our content will be down here, but the splitter is up here. So eventually, we're going to decide to put that in the main content area, as I'll show you in a second. And how to spot this if you sometimes are creating it, you forget that you need to put it in there. So the one other thing I want to do for property of the navigation pane is to give it a name. So I'll call it for CSS class, I'll call it main splitter. Now, by doing that, you can see that it did a couple of things CSS-wise. Now, one of the things I want to point out, people are always asking me, like, hey, what about your controls versus the vendor controls? I can tell you, we take a look at a lot of good stuff out there. At least for design time, I don't think anybody gives you the beautiful design time experience that we do. Now, sometimes that comes at a cost, but absolutely, when you're working with our controls at design time, you get this really rich experience with the designer. And so if you're using web forms, this is a huge benefit for you when you want to see how things are going to be laid out, how they will look, and so forth. All right. So far, what we've done is created a splitter. We created a master page, and we've added a splitter control to it. But we can't really look at the splitter page because we cannot look at a master page. If you want to look at what the master page looks like, you have to create a page that derives from the master page. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a web form page that derives from this master page, and I'll call this products. So we're going to make a version of that products page that we saw, and it's going to derive from site.master. Now, just to make sure I show you the difference, I'm going to create and call it products. Now, for compare and contrast, let's add another page, and we'll call this employees, and also derived from site.master, and this one will simply say employees. Now, this goes along with the theme, as I mentioned, of creating modules. All right, so now let's take a look at this in the browser. Now, when we take a look at employees, right now I see that it's using my CSS file, so I've got that nice gray background. And you saw me type employees. In fact, if I go to products, I get the products page, but I don't see anything in there. And that's because when you're creating a master page, it creates an area called a content placeholder. Now, this content placeholder typically has to be inside of one of these areas. What I want to do is I want to put it inside of our main content page. So as you saw, I simply dragged the content placeholder and put it inside of the main content area. You can do it through source view, or you can do it through the design view. So now, if we go back to our products page or employees page, we should see products. And you can see right now that, okay, I've got where it says products, and if I go to employees, I can see I've got my employees. And why is it over here? I've got things that are kind of hidden. So let's take a look. If we go back to our default DXPX, we go back to our site.master, and I'm going to simply disable our CSS that kind of hides some of those items. Call it, just rename it to a class that doesn't exist. We'll be able to see the line separators. So, as I mentioned, here's our splitter control. Here's the top pane, here's the bottom pane. Now, as you remember, I gave the bottom area a 90 pixel size, which means that because it is laid out vertically, it is 90 pixels high. Now, you saw that I gave the logo area, the main content area a minimum size of 300 pixels. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is the logo area has a hard size, meaning that, for example, if I go up, the logo is going to stay at 300 pixels. So what happens is this top area, I gave it a 210 pixel minimum. I gave it a 300 pixel minimum size. So it's going to stay at 300 pixels, and then it's going to cut off the bottom area, which essentially allows us to create a responsive UI, meaning that items within here are going to, so for example, if I put a grid in here, it's going to be able to automatically resize. All right, let's move on. I'm running a little low on time here. So as you can see, the splitter is great in some scenarios, and this is one of those scenarios if you want to have a responsive UI and quickly have a design time view with a rich API for handling events like resizing grids and so forth. So there's a client-side API with our splitter control that lets you send messages at the client side to things like our grid control or do callbacks with other panes and so forth. So there's a lot of interesting things you can do there. All right. Let's switch back to our site.master, keep this. Now I mentioned in our default ASPX file, I'm going to do simply one thing, and that is just add a response.redirect, and we will simply go to the products page. And this is the page that I'll build out. All right. So the reason we did that, and if you look at our main demo, we do a similar thing, and I'll talk about it, is that it's because of that patterns thing. All right, so now we've got a look that essentially is just very plain at the moment. What I want to do is I want to get closer to our current look. Now, let's go back to our demo, and let's bring this one. Oops. Mistyped redirect here. All right, so let's take a look at our our employees page. You can see we've got a very basic look at the moment. And let me bring this up in my other Chrome. I like to use Firefox sometimes for debugging. All right, so far, all we've got is this default layout. I want to start building this out. You can see we can build quickly this stuff out, and so we can show you. So let's start doing that, because I want to talk about some pattern practices thing. So the first thing is we're going to go to site.master, I'll go to design view, and I'm going to add a image control for our logo. So I'm going to use the ASPX image control, and I'll simply point this image URL to the content main logo file. Now, in our demo, we've got this awesome menu here. So if I just mouse over, and when we were designing this, we thought, one of the things we're actually doing is we're taking the main navigation. Normally this is where navigation might happen. We're actually using filtering here, but we put the main navigation for the modules here. And in a way, you say, well, is it intuitive? And it may not be, but after your customer uses it the first time, they'll know exactly where to go. And it saves you space. And it's beautiful. It's got this beautiful look to it using our theme and our menu. I'm going to show you how easy it is to achieve that. So I'm going to use the ASPX menu control. And sometimes you may ask, well, when do you make this data bound and when do you not? Well, a menu typically doesn't change a lot. So a menu, I would make it static. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create 2 items in it. Now, to achieve that little drop-down type of look, I'm going to basically create something called a root item and remove the base text. And then the subtext items are basically my products page and my employees page. And I'm going to set their navigate URL because I get a couple of nice, I get a nice benefit by doing that. I'll show you in just a second. Set the products page. All right, and that's it. And I'll set one other item, is that I will call this navigation menu. And I'll set its CSS class as well. All right, so let's take a look now All right, now just by adding that, we've got our logo, but we've also got the menu. And as you can see, I haven't clicked anything, but just as soon as I mouse over, it knows I'm on the product screen, so it highlights that menu for me. When I go to the employees, it highlights the employees for me. So it's a very slick way to add a navigation menu. Now, let me talk about one of the first good patterns that we used in here. When we were first creating this demo, we had a couple of different devs working on this. And what we found is that they were recreating things like this toolbar and menu on this different modules. And that didn't make sense because really, if it's in a master page, it should only exist once. So rather than put this in the sub-modules like a products page, we said, no, this should exist in the master page. So what we said is that, listen, when we create this, we want to be able to do it smartly. So what's happening is next to this menu, I've got an image. So when I switch over to products, it says products, and that's just an image. And the smart way to do that is to create a pattern where the site.master page is aware of what module loads in there, whether it's products or employees. So the way to do that is to use this pattern that allows us to bubble up a property that identifies itself to the master page. And so we've created this thing called base page. And all base page is simply an abstract class that still derives from system.web.ui page class, but it's called base page, and adds a property called page name, and that's it. And therefore, if we go to the products page and we take a look, products right now derives from system.ui.web.page. So we said, okay, we're going to keep that, but instead I'm going to have you derive from base page. And now I can use a property called page name because it now derives from base page. So because it derives from base page, it has a property called page name, I'm able to give it something called products. Now let's do this for page name as well, and then we're going to see why it's useful. So we'll call it base page, and we'll add page name. And however, in this case, this will be the employees. All right, now when we take a look at this in the browser, we're going to say, okay, well, that's great. But that's because we're not actually doing anything with that property. We've added this property, but now it's up to us in that site.master page to make use of that. So let's do that. So what we want to do is now leverage that property. So I'm going to add a little bit of code here that allows me to do that. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm creating a variable, and I say, what I'm telling site.master is I said, hey, site.master, in your collection of controls that loads up, you have an object called base page. So I want to create a variable of type base page. So go get that variable. And so in the page init, I create a method called setupPage, and in setupPage just says, listen, if in your module that you're loading, if it doesn't derive from base page, if you don't find a variable called base page in your collection, just exit this setupPage. But if you do, then what I want to do is I want you to get the base.page name, which in our case we know it's either products or employees. And what I want you to do with that is I want you to take the navigation menu, and I want you to take the root item. The root item is that one the top item, which is that triangle, and I want you to set an image for it. And the image is basically pointing to the content folder, and in there, take the name of whatever the base page is, whether it's products or it's employees, and load up that image. So it's loading up that PNG. So now, rather than saying, hey, let me put that menu in a subpage and then load those images separately and hard code them, this allows me to bubble up that page name property and do some interesting things. And now the site.master page is handling that. So therefore now, when I load up the products page, I get this nice image. And if I go to employees, I get employees. And as you can see, now I can do a whole ton of things that contextually I can do for the site.master page based on the module. So it's a very powerful pattern that allows you to really leverage and separate out functionality while lowering the amount of controls you may need to use. All right, so let's go on. So let's go back to site.master. And now I'm going to add that filter control. And what I'm going to use is actually, it's a navbar control. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to add this navbar, but I'm going to replace it with a sort of hard-coded one. And the reason is because just in the same way that I did the menu, and in the server side, I contextually load those items, I can do that as well. So I'm going to leave the navbar alone to kind of show you that it's very easy to set up this navbar in the same way that you did the menu, and as I'm going to show you in a minute with a toolbar as well. Now, for the footer, we're just going to use a image control. So I will use the ASPX image control again, and I'll point its URL property to the footer logo. And for the footer text, I'll simply drop in a little bit of, in my footer text pane, a little call to action. Let's move up here, flash this, bring in the footer text. That simply says, hey, it's powered by DevExpress, go get the demo, etc., etc. All right, so now I've got a pretty good looking UI. I'm getting pretty close. So let's take a look and see how we're looking so far. So as you can see, I've got my main menu, I've got the filtering area, I've got the footer area, and now I want to put in the toolbar in the main content area. So let's do that. So we're going to go to site.master, and this is where I want to have my toolbar. So for the toolbar, I'm also going to use a menu control. And you say, well, why menu? Well, because the menu has a property that allows you to show as a toolbar. So if you go to ASPX menu and you show it as a toolbar here, set that to true, it'll display them as toolbar buttons. It's a beautiful, awesome thing. Now, in the solution you saw in app data, I had this file called toolbar.xml. Now, in this case, I do want different items for that toolbar based on the module I'm in. So if I'm in products, I want these 3 buttons. If I'm in employees, I want these 2 buttons. Tasks, etc., etc. So this toolbar is a great way that does that. So because it's an XML file, I need a XML data source. So let me bring that XML data source in. And this is a non-visual control, so you can put it actually behind this one. It doesn't matter. I like to put it at the bottom. Now I'm going to configure this data source, point it to our toolbar XML file, and because it does have a lot of different items, I do want an XPath expression in here, but I'm not going to put it in here. Why is that? Because I need to know the context, and again, this is where our pattern comes in handy. So what I'm going to do is I've created the XML, I've pointed it. Now I'm going to tell this XML data source, I'm going to tell the menu, say, hey, use this XML data source. So if we just take a look at this right now, it's not gonna make a lot of sense right now, because we've got the toolbar button. Because it's loading up all the items, not just products, it's showing us this menu, which is not what I want. What it would normally do is if it only had 3 items, it would show 3 buttons, and that's what I want to do. So let's do that. Let's tell it to filter the toolbar. So in order to do that, I'm going to say, hey, XML data source, I want you to create a property in your init file. So what I'm going to do is let's replace this with a little bit of code that says, hey, XML data source, when you get initialized, I want you to set an XPath expression that says, listen, load up the page based on either products, load up the items for either products or employees or whatever module that they're on. So once again, a very simple pattern allows us to quickly and powerfully leverage this UI metaphor. Now, listen, I apologize. I know we're getting close to it. We're almost done. I've only got one other thing to show, but I will run just a couple of minutes over. All right, so now you can see I've got the 3 buttons, and if I go to employees, I've got those 2 buttons, and it's a beautiful metaphor. Now, let me talk about the last interesting pattern here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to products, and you can see now, instead of adding the grid to site.master, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to add it here. Now, I'm going to actually add the product grid. And all this is ASP.NET Grid View. And I'm not going to go into too much. We have tons of grid videos and webinars about the ASP.NET Grid View. What I will tell you is that the grid view simply has some columns set up, but you can see I don't have any data source on the grid. Well, why is that? Well, you remember that I mentioned that we have a common database that we're using. So when you've got a common database, it only makes sense that you also leverage a common set of patterns. A common data layer. So if you take a look, when we first created this demo, we started with the WinForms. We said, well, you know, typically a lot of businesses will do that. They'll have a rich WinForms app, then they'll make a website and so forth. So if you look at in the WinForms demo, you'll find DevExpress DevAV. You'll find the DevExpress model. The DevExpress data. Now this is the data layer. If you bring up this Visual Studio solution, you can see all the different interfaces we've created for this. And then you can look at the different models that we've created around that and all the different modules that use that. So what I'm going to do is in the products server side, to data bind to that product screen, I'm using, as I mentioned, Entity Framework. I'm using entities from Entity Framework. So what I'm going to do is going to replace a little bit of this code, and we're going to say, listen, I've still got my good old base page name, which is products, but I've added a couple of methods. And the first is, in page load, I said, hey, the ASPX Grid View, when you first start loaded, I want you to use something called get products. Now, our ASP.NET controls can bind to anything that supports IEnumerable. So what I'm doing is I'm using the data layer. And in order to do that, I'm bringing in the DevExpress DevAV file, and it has this data layer, the DevAV data model, which, as I mentioned, you can take a look at. And what it does, it allows me to use this interface. Now, in get products, what we're doing is we're simply returning something very simple, an object, but it supports IEnumerable. But what it does, it calls this method called getUOW. Now, if you work with any ORM, Object Relational Mapping tool, you'll know that UOW stands for Unit of Work. And a unit of work it's almost like a transaction, not exactly, but it allows you to encapsulate some work, either getting data or saving data and so forth. It's very powerful. If you take a look at our XPO technology, you can learn more about it. But what unit of work does, in our case, it creates a connection string using that connection string from our web config file, and after it gets that connection string, it says, okay, listen, I've got a connection string, and now I'm getting this unit of work object. And I can use that unit of work object to say, listen, I know you have an entity called products. Give me everything you have inside of products. And then it returns that to the ASPX Grid View for data binding. And therefore, when we now run the project, our ASPX Grid View is able to give us this beautifully connected grid. Now, if we take a look, let me bring this up next to the DevAV demo in Chrome here. Now, within a matter of 30 minutes or so, here's the full DevAV demo online. Here's our version that we created very quickly, very easily. And like I said, the ASPX splitter in full screen mode gives us this responsive UI, has client-side API. And, there's a lot of ways to do something in software. This is just one of the ways that we recommend sometimes. Sometimes we like to do this. So if you are a web forms person, if you like the design time aspect of it, I highly recommend it. Take a look at it. If you're somebody into MVC and you want to use the div approach, use that. Do what makes you happy. But DevExpress controls are very flexible, very powerful, and more importantly, beautiful and very functional. So as I mentioned, we've got this nice responsive UI, and you can take a look at the full DevAV demo to learn. How do we add this control? How do we do the rating pane? How do the callbacks work, and so forth? So, and you also see in the main DevAV demo, we do a lot with user control. So that's another pattern that we don't really have too much time to talk about in this webinar, but maybe we can in a future one. All right. So I've talked a lot. I wanted to save the questions for the end. Uh, Please feel free to ask questions. Now before I finish, I will show you that. Listen, oops. Let's go back to the slides here. The online demo, you can go to it by going to DevExpress.com and looking under our demos. Here's the direct URL: demos.devexpress.com/real-world-app RWA/DevAV. Now, the full source code is available with our install. You don't even need the DevExpress license, and that's the reason we do that is because we want you to explore our demos. Now, more than explore our demos, take our demos. The reason I did this demo today is I want you to be inspired. We have a whole team of smart designers, smart developers that work hard on this stuff. Take our hard work and then, make it your own. And if you do, please send me a Twitter. Please send me an email. I love seeing the stuff our customers are doing with our controls. So, hang on one second. Let me expand this. Okay, so Bradley, somebody asked about our Windows desktop. I'll get to that real quick, Bradley. Let me just finish up with these slides here. This demo that I just showed you today is available online. If you go to github.com/Mehul, look under DevAV Lite, you can see the full source code of the sample that I just created. So definitely check out this demo, download it, and play with it. And again, I'm Mehul Harry. This is my email, mharry@devexpress.com. Here's me on Twitter. Reach out. Love to hear from you. And if you are interested, like Bradley is, in our WinForms controls, I would recommend that you ping us at info@devexpress.com. If you've got general questions about what kind of controls we offer, then you can. We actually have an online chat at devexpress.com. So feel free to reach out to us. And if you have any specific questions that I can help answer, Bradley, or I can connect you up with somebody, for example, Seth or Julian or somebody, we have a lot of smart people at DevExpress that can help answer these questions. So once again, thank you very much for hanging out. I apologize for running over a little bit. And if you have questions, let me know. I'll stick around for a few more seconds. It doesn't look like there's a lot of questions. But thank you for attending, and I appreciate your attention to this. Now, while I've got a second, I will tell you, definitely come check us out on Facebook as well. We've got an awesome Facebook page, facebook.com/DevExpress. Lots of good stuff that we're putting out there today. Yeah, so definitely come check us out on Facebook, on Twitter. I appreciate you coming out today, and thanks again. I will see you guys soon.